What are trauma memories? Can you explain verbally accessible memories as opposed to situationally accessible memories?
Well, I like the term trauma memory, and since I met Chris Brewin, that's B-R-E-W-I-N, who's a psychologist from London, I've had a new way to think about this, and let me credit Chris. He came up with the terms verbally accessible memory and situationally accessible memory, the VAM and the SAM. And according to Chris, our brains have both of these systems, and they work at the same time. It's like having a computer that can process in two different ways at once. And the SAM creates the kind of memory that's going to come back to you on an anniversary, or that's going to come back to you when you hear the music that was there at the time that something significant happened. It's situationally accessible memory. And it doesn't necessarily exist in words and in sequences. So it's stored in a different way. And I think trauma memory comes from the SAM. And it means that at some time, without wanting to, without putting it in words, without even thinking in words, boom, you're there. You're at the bad place that happened a year or two ago. Now, the verbally accessible memory is the kind of memory that's autobiographical. It's got sequence. You have a sense of how long ago it was, that strange measuring stick of the mind that can tell the difference between a 2-year-old memory and a 1-year-old memory. And according to Chris, trauma gets stored in both systems. And these systems almost compete. If the SAM outweighs the VAM, you're more likely to have PTSD. Your memory is traumatic. It comes at you in that explosive way, and that way that is hard to put into words. If your VAM outweighs your SAM, oh, you can have a bad dream, you could have a flashback, but you really have mastered your memory. You're able to talk about it. You can think about it coherently. You can express it. So one way to think about therapy is not really transferring the SAM to the VAM, but it's helping to beef up the VAM, and it's helping to quiet the SAM. I once told Chris, I once wrote a piece in which I said, well, we're taking it from the SAM and putting it in the VAM. And Chris was kind. He smiled. He says, no, I don't see it quite that way, Frank. I see it more as these are always going to be there, and they're always going to compete, but we're going to have more in the VAM. Now, let me tell you about a question I got in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. I was meeting with very, very experienced psychiatrists, psychologists, and trying to answer tough questions that they had. And one had a question about a man who was a war veteran who had been successfully treated for his PTSD in the wars over there. But then he had a stroke, and his PTSD came back. What would I do? Well, I realized his stroke would have interfered with his VAM. Strokes often hurt the verbally accessible mechanisms of the mind. So first thing you need to do is treat the stroke and do everything you can to help restore the capacity of the VAM. And there's medication like Neurontin that helps, and there's cognitive training and rehabilitation. That's the first thing. Then you may want to do some of the mechanisms that we use for dealing with trauma memory, including the counting method, but not before you had made some progress with the VAM. So that's an example of how Brewin's formulation helped. To me, a trauma memory is a memory that exists in the trauma system. And we can have autobiographical memories of traumatic events. They're not quite the same as a trauma memory.